Thanks so much for a chance to chat with you this evening. My name is Kevon Martis. I am the director of the IICC. I have a degree from the University of Michigan, and I was also the vice chairman of the Ragged Township Zoning and Planning Board. In 2008, a wind developer approached our community, which is how I got involved in this. We ultimately created a wind turbine zoning ordinance that was adopted as a state model ordinance, along with several other ordinances. I'm very proud of that. Ultimately, the wind developers decided they were not comfortable with that ordinance because it required them to get the consent of the people who were going to have to live with the devices in order for them to proceed. They prefer zoning that gives you free use of neighboring parcels without consent or compensation. You may not agree with everything I have to say tonight. I'm a volunteer of a volunteer organization. I have no financial stake in anything, and I'm not here to sell you gas, coal, nuclear, wind, or solar, or anything else. I'm here to talk about options at a very high level, about here's the realities, here's the things we might want to correct in our energy policy, and here's our alternatives, and here's what it's going to cost. I give testimony. I've been to DC and met with legislators. I've testified in both the Ohio House and Senate, as well as in Michigan. I'll be in front of the Senate next week talking to them about energy policy again. So, we're a bipartisan group, approximately 40% Democrat, 60% Republican. We have supporters all around the state, from anywhere from self-identified liberal environmentalists to free market libertarians. Many of us are living with turbines every day. I am not in my community. Many of my friends are. We want energy policy that I think we could all agree with. Affordable, reliable, socially and environmentally responsible. Policy affects people. These are my friends' home, Carrie and Karen Schindeldecker. They live in Ludington. That's Consumers Energy's wind turbine there. They spent about $255 million constructing the project. They got $73 million back from the stimulus package. Seems to me they may have been short on cash. I'm not certain. I thought consumers could afford to build them on their own. What's interesting to note is that this house is 500 feet closer to that turbine than the manufacturer says is the safe radius for their employees to remain in the event of a brake failure. So if they're working on that thing and the brake fails, they have to run 500 feet past the Schindeldecker's home to get to that safe radius. That argument is almost never successful when you're trying to establish safe zoning. Say, well, the manufacturer says 1,640 feet. Why would you put my house 500 feet closer? Oh, you won't have any problems. And guess what? They prevail as long as they own 3 or 4 of your township trustees. If you ask me what's the common denominator among why wind got situated where it is in Michigan, not primarily wind resource. It's did you have county or township level zoning where you could get enough buy-in from the elected officials by giving them a wind lease to push the project through. Guess what wind has taught me? 500-foot tall wind turbines do not care about your political preferences when they're keeping one's children awake at night and one's spouse is taking sleeping medication to go to sleep in the basement. The home I just showed you, those people are living in their basement now only when the turbines operate. When they shut off, they come back upstairs. I've also learned that Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and Socialists all want clean air and water. We all do. And I've learned that monopoly utilities can act callously with respect to wildlife when they build wind generation as well. If you look at who builds industrial scale wind turbines in Michigan, it's all, none of them are pure wind players. They are all fossil fuel utilities or nuclear utilities. Exelon, Detroit Edison, Florida Power and Light. So it turns out that a wind energy subsidy is a fossil fuel subsidy, as I will not get to, so I'll say it now. Florida Power and Light, which is building many turbines in the thumb right now, and I think they've submitted an application for 590 footers. They're only paying an effective 1.25% federal income tax rate. They have 9,000 turbines and building more. It's essentially made them operate their fossil and natural gas fleet tax-free. They just recently announced that they've completed the largest gas-fired combined cycle gas turbine plant in the middle of the Everglades, 1,000 feet from the entrance of a wildlife refuge.
But don't we have a state law saying that a certain percentage of our energy has to be generated by turbines by a certain year?
Yes, by 2015, the law was structured to say we have to be 10% renewables by 2015. It's called Public Act 295. They gave us credit for the 4% biomass and hydro we already have, the 2.5% wind, which will be online by the end of next year. Added to the 4 gets us to 6.5%, but they counted so many other things as renewables, like upgrading the pumped hydro storage. If you build parts for alternative energy systems, you get more RECs. It turns out 6.5 actually equals 10. So if people tell you we've gone from 0 to 10% wind energy in Michigan, it's just not true. We've gone from 4% renewable to 6.5%, yet it counts as 10. So that's where we're at with that right now.
I think what might be best for us to do is all ask our questions after Kevin's
I don't want to hold this.
presentation here, because I want to make sure that we get a chance to
Sure.
enjoy all this, and learn from it all.
The state gave some siting recommendations under the Granholm administration. They recommended 55 decibel noise limits and 1,000-foot setbacks from homes, even though the World Health Organization recommends 40 decibels or lower outside your home at night. The latest report on renewable energy, out of which you probably heard the headline numbers, which is the state says we can hit 30% renewables with no problem, also recommended lowering noise limits below 40 decibels and the setbacks from homes to 1.25 miles. No wind development in the state of Michigan has ever been built with setbacks beyond about 1,400 feet. And here's what happens when the wind, and here's why, if you don't understand why people in rural communities are so upset. If wind developers came up and said 1,640 feet from the center of the turbine to my property line, you could at least say there's some rational relationship to published data from the manufacturer for that setback. But instead they come in and say, I'm going to measure these setbacks from your home, not from your property line. So guess what? Farmer B next door can no longer build anything on his property. He's now inside that setback radius. You've just given Florida Power and Light your property in exchange for no compensation and no consent. And that's how they are cited everywhere in the state of Michigan. If you push them back to the property lines, it forces them to negotiate too many leases with too many people, and they flee. Here's what it looks like in Gratiot County. The developer bragged that it took him 50 cups of coffee per megawatt to sell this project. Here's what it looks like in Huron County. Monica showed you the picture. I think this is Pigeon. I took these pictures myself. And here's Missaukee County. Missaukee County has the first home abandoned due to low frequency wind turbine noise in the state of Michigan. Now, it also affects wildlife. Monica mentioned this already. Fish and Wildlife Service recommends a 3-mile Great Lakes shoreline setback for industrial wind development. But do wind developers care? They didn't in those spots. And when the Fish and Wildlife Service objects, this is one of the most strongly worded letters I've seen from Fish and Wildlife, where they said, based on the data currently available, we must once again recommend that you not construct a commercial wind development on the Garden Peninsula because of the high potential for avian mortalities in violation of federal wildlife laws. It didn't stop them. There's 14 turbines in the Garden Peninsula. On this table, and you can have them when I'm done, there's that entire letter is there in its entirety. You can have that. There's also a petition from 73 people who live around those turbines saying, can't you shut the things off? It's driving us bananas. And about bats. Monica mentioned this. Now, Lenawee County, where I live, which is down here, Dr. Alan Kurta from Eastern Michigan got involved with our project because we have a substantial number of Indiana bats there, which are endangered, and the white-nosed fungus issue is a problem. He predicted 2 other species living in our township would be placed on the endangered list very soon. So, Alan Kurta, a bat expert and biology professor, said Lenawee is also the habitat for 3 other bats that are on the verge of being endangered or considered. What I'm hoping for is that the developers act in a responsible way. Exelon said it is conducting a study about the county's bats. They did. We took pictures. They came in and one day mist netted across the forest to collect bats. They found none. Dr. Kurta, in an email, wrote back, and when he said, Dr. Kurta, they said they didn't find any bats in Lenawee County. They said, then ask them, what the hell did I study for the last 3 years? That's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with their independent experts. I'll speed up a little because this can take forever. This is where we get our energy from now. It's changed slightly since 2011. We're like 48% coal. The good news is the right-hand side of that generating package, we're at about 2.2% wind now. It's largely very low emissions. Hydro, none. Nuclear, essentially none. And natural gas has no mercury emissions, trace amounts. You know, you have it burning in your house if you cook with gas. And it has no fine particulate emissions relatively compared to coal. I mean, it's trivial amounts. And its CO2 emissions in combined cycle are about 60% less than coal. So that half of our portfolio is relatively clean. We actually have a fairly low carbon intensity for our electrical generation compared to many other states, including wind-heavy Iowa. Now, here's what we're hearing from wind promoters in the state. Wind energy is getting cheaper, and we're led to believe that Michigan will gain a competitive advantage through low-cost wind energy, and that we're falling behind states like Iowa. But is that true? Well, here's a wind map. The purple is 8.5 meter per second wind, and the brown and orange is 6.5 meter per second. Now, this gentleman here, before he dozed off, told me that the energy available from a turbine is equal to the cube of the wind speed, and he's absolutely right. What that means is, if you take a $3 million turbine and put it in Michigan or in Iowa, you'll get twice as much electricity out of that turbine in Iowa as you will in Michigan. Just like saying Iowa has a river and we have a river. They have the Mississippi and we have the Grand. So how about hydro? Let's mandate a lot of hydro because it works in Iowa. Well, they get a 120 megawatt hydro plant on the Mississippi. We get 3 megawatt hydro on the Grand. What's my point? Neither race is one that we can win. We can't compete with Iowa in wind on price, and we can't compete with them in hydroelectric. It's obvious on the river, it's not so obvious with the wind. Now people will say with this latest batch of turbines, which are much taller, we're able to compete with them. But look what the National Renewable Energy Lab said. If you follow this line right here, that's the trend line for the cost of energy in Michigan and Ohio, and this is for Iowa and Minnesota. They remain parallel. No matter what the turbine technological improvement is, you put it in a stronger wind resource, you'll make more energy for less money. We can never catch up. It's not possible. It is somewhat better, but we will never catch the cheap wind states. Right now, our state law prevents us from importing cheap wind electricity from Iowa and counting it towards our renewable mandate. It turns out that's unconstitutional, but nonetheless, it still exists. Here's another big problem with wind that not everybody understands. It's produced, well, my hand's not shaking, intermittent, inverse to demand. So here's wind's output, even as demand is very high. And you see the green line is almost always opposite of the demand line. That's just because wind blows primarily at night, and seasonally blows primarily spring and fall when demand for electricity is low. And it's almost there, not at all, in July and August when demand is high. What this means is electricity that can be supplied by a wind generator at 6 cents a kilowatt hour is not cheap if that output is variable primarily at night when the market value of that electricity is only 2.5 cents. It just stands to reason. People don't understand the value of electricity changes substantially from morning and night. So you're actually flooding wind energy onto the grid late at night when there's very little demand, to the point that grid operators will pay, instead of collect, they will pay up to $35 a megawatt hour at night for them to take the electricity from them. That's leading Exelon to consider closing 3 existing nuclear plants in Illinois that have no emissions. You can argue about the radioactivity, but they're not emitting fine particulates, they're not emitting mercury, they're not emitting, what's the other, SOx, NOx, any of them, CO2, and you're going to replace them with wind, which has to be paired with gas. It makes very little sense. Secondly, it's common to believe that high penetrations of wind energy naturally lead to lower coal emissions. Iowa has over 20% wind today, Michigan has only 2.2%. But look what we see from EIA data. CO2 emissions from coal has risen steadily in Iowa, even as wind generation has gone now well above 20%. The guys in Iowa say our emissions from coal will start to drop when we begin to replace coal with gas. We've seen a drop in CO2 across the U.S., and it's because of shale gas. I'm not here telling shale gas is an answer either, but the fact is, it is cleaning up our air right now, and this wind in Iowa has not. Most of that wind energy is being exported into other states. Now, we all are concerned about externalities. This is Ohio in 1912. I have little doubt that there were real and profound health impacts from that kind of pollution. I'm not here to argue that point. The good news is, even without renewable mandates, Toledo looks like this now. Ohio only has about 200 turbines in operation. They have less than 1% wind. So the good news is our air is far cleaner than it has been. In fact, looking at most of the main pollutants, we see even since 1990 that, from SOx, NOx, PM2.5, mercury, and ozone are all dropping substantially. The scrubbers and so forth have made a tremendous impact. There is no doubt. I'm not here selling you coal. I'm here showing the data. But what if we decided that this still isn't clean enough? And we see a lot of studies that talk about these things. You may have read Michigan Environmental Council's report on the 9 dirty coal plants in Michigan. Some of these are being closed by the EPA anyways. The EPA is cleaning our air far faster than renewable energy mandates ever will. That's just a fact. They have about 5,000 megawatts capacity in the state of Michigan. Let's say we want to close them. here's a scientific reality. There's only 4 ways we can replace these and reduce their emissions. One is with 5,000 megawatts of nuclear. Another is with 5,000 megawatts of combined cycle natural gas turbines. 5,000 megawatts of advanced coal with carbon capture and sequestration, which is not commercially viable. Or 5,000 megawatts of gas plus wind plus transmission. You can't replace it with wind by itself. Wind spends too much time at zero output, which means you have no electricity. And what we learned in the winter, in January 7, with the polar vortex, PJM was within 200 megawatts of brownouts. And when it's 15 below zero, you don't just become uncomfortable without electricity, you often die. So energy policy is a life and death matter. And you say, well, what about wind plus storage? Well, we can get very detailed, but with a very low capacity factor product like wind energy, only 30% of its nameplate value will be generated over the course of the year because its fuel, wind, doesn't show up regularly enough. You'd have to build massive new pumped hydro storage, 3 to 1, 3 megawatts of wind for every 1 megawatt of fossil you wanted to close, well beyond $200 a megawatt hour. It would take $70 billion to construct, but we don't even have enough land mass to do that, and nobody is seriously proposing to do so. Even if you wanted to start today, it would take 20 or 30 years for this ever to come to fruition. So the truth is, Michigan's wind binds us permanently to fossil fuel generation because we need flexible capacity to balance wind's intermittent output. A board member of the American Wind Energy Association explains, wind energy is only able to replace traditional power stations to a limited extent due to their dependence on prevailing wind conditions. Traditional power station with capacities equal to 90% of the installed wind power capacity must be permanently online in order to guarantee power supply at all times. There's no such thing as wind by itself. Secondly, many people are not aware of this. In the Midwest, wind is paired most often with gas-fired generation for backup and balancing. High penetrations of wind demand more gas generation, thus fracking. If we went to 30% wind generation in the state of Michigan, we'd probably have to replace our nuclear plants with gas plants in order to balance the wind's output. The net result would be increased emissions. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's more wind, and it's like I just said, it's exactly what I said. Must be I knew what I wrote. But secondly, because gas and wind have to be there, you're now buying 2 megawatts of generation to furnish only 1 megawatt of output. You have to buy the 1,000 megawatts of wind, and now you have to add to the 1,000 megawatts of gas. Whereas if you closed 1,000 megawatts of coal, you could just buy the gas by itself. You get rid of most of your pollutants by doing that. Adding wind to gas will reduce your CO2 instead of 60%, 72%. It only adds another 12% reduction. Yet it more than doubles the cost. So it's a question of cost-benefit analysis. Since wind is dependent upon fossil fuel generation, any environmental impacts associated with wind generators must be added to the impacts already associated with fossil and nuclear. This means wind bird kills are added to any coal or gas bird kills. They don't replace it. They're added to it. The wind developers say we are now the biggest new source of generation in the United States. You'll read that headline a lot. Added to that, they are now the biggest new source of avian and bat impacts in the United States. If we go from 2% to, in the U.S. we have about 4% wind generation right now, 3.5 to 4. If we take that to 40, you can multiply the bird deaths by 10. And the house cat thing drives me bananas. House cats kill more birds than wind turbines. They don't kill eagles. Wind turbines do.
Raptors kill kittens.
Now, quickly, you'll also hear this. They're saying that wind energy is now cheaper than energy from new coal plants, which they value at $133 a megawatt hour. But only if you try and pretend that you can replace a coal plant with wind turbines by themselves. You can't. We tie it to gas, which brings the price well above $149. Wind plus gas is more expensive than a new coal plant. That coal plant number includes carbon capture and sequestration, which doesn't exist. That's how disingenuous the comparison is. Here's another problem for wind and CO2. If you're very concerned about CO2, the IICC takes no position on CO2. Some of us think it's a huge problem, some of us aren't sure. It's like arguing with somebody about whether or not God exists. I can't measure CO2. I don't know what happened 10,000 years ago, and I don't know who's lying to me about it. It's something that I can't prove. Some people are certain global warming is a huge problem. Other people are very skeptical. If you think it's a problem, here's the bad news. If you replace coal generation with a new combined cycle gas turbine, which is what's happening in Michigan, and is going to keep happening in Michigan whether you like it or not, because the coal plants are being closed by EPA. We're powerless to stop that. And so gas will be built. It's the cheap and fast solution. We can reduce CO2 at about 30 bucks a ton with a $5 natural gas price. Adding wind to that does reduce some additional CO2, but at the price of $300 a ton. For every dollar spent on wind, 10 times more reductions could be achieved by building combined cycle gas alone. The National Academy of Sciences, who strongly is concerned about global warming, says the reduction in CO2 associated with the wind production tax credit is small, amounting to about 0.3% of CO2 emissions. You go down a little bit. If the revenue lost as a result of the PTC is divided by the reduction in CO2 emissions, just under $250 in tax revenues to the Treasury are lost per ton of CO2 reduced. While this does not represent the social cost of reducing the ton of CO2, the fiscal cost per ton of CO2 reduced is high relative to other more efficient approaches. I don't make up the science, but the truth is, if you want CO2 eliminated completely, quickly, and cheaply, wind doesn't do it. It just doesn't. Gas plants close coal plants permanently. You can do a one-for-one replacement on the same site with no new transmission and on an existing brownfield. We have spent $2.5 billion worth of on wind and transmission in the state of Michigan since 2008. At most, we've reduced coal generation by 2%. Likely it's less because wind usually interrupts gas and not coal because gas can ramp up and down more quickly. Had we spent $2.5 billion on combined cycle gas turbines, we could have closed half of those dirtiest coal plants permanently. Statewide PM 2.5 emissions would have been cut by half, mercury emissions would have already been cut by half, and CO2 would have been cut by 25%. Instead, we spent $2.5 billion and got maybe a 2% reduction, and wind turbines only last about 20 years, so you're going to spend the $2.5 billion again. Not so very far from now. James Hansen now, many of you will be familiar with him, he says it well, I agree with him, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the US, China, India, or the world as a whole is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. Wind takes an incredible long time to build, it doesn't produce a great deal of energy, it's very capital intensive, and it's not a one-for-one replacement. What I would like is I would love to have solar panels on my roof with battery that allow me to cut my ties with Detroit Edison or Consumers Energy. That's what I would like to have happen. When that happens, I would encourage everybody to do it. It's way too expensive right now. That would be my ideal solution. What about energy density? Here's the Fermi 2 reactor in Monroe. They make 1,100 megawatts on that 1 square mile. This gentleman here spent a lot of time engineering nuclear plants. If you wanted to replace that plant with windmills, you could do it. You start from Toledo, go to Detroit, and almost to Ann Arbor. Every last square mile in there will have to have 2 500-foot tall Vestas V100 turbines to replace that plant, but we're not done. You still have to build 1,000 megawatts of combined cycle gas plants somewhere for the days when the wind doesn't blow. Irene Dimitri, who Monica referenced earlier from Detroit Edison, she said 2 years ago, I could sit in the control room and see what we were getting from our wind fleet in July and August. A big, fat goose egg. In other words, one township like this is the Schindeldecker home where they now sleep in their basement when the turbines are spinning. They have 56 V100 turbines, Danish turbines. Consumers Energy built it. 36 square miles covered with that to create the same amount of electricity that can be generated by the semi-trailer mounted simple cycle gas turbine that you can hide inside your average dairy barn. That $2.25 billion investment will only produce a little over 20 megawatts of energy year in, year out. Our average capacity is 12,500 megawatts. We also know long-term is that renewable energy, high percentages of it result in expensive electricity. There's little doubt. At 35 and 40 cents a kilowatt hour, that's almost 3 times the price of what we're paying for electricity right now. You say, well, it may be worth it. But what if you work in the steel industry? Every 10% increase in electric rates, the steel industry in America uses $18 billion a year of electricity. That's an awful lot of electricity. Raise that 10%, that's $1.8 billion a year extra they pay. They have 100,000 employees in the steel manufacturers unions across the country. Take that at $1.8 billion out of them in electricity rates, and you just lost $18,000 per employee per year that's no longer available for union wages, fringes, and benefits. I went to U of M. We spend $61 million a year on electricity at U of M. Raise their electricity 10%. That's a $215 per year per student tuition increase, or they could fire 143 teaching assistants. Energy is overhead for all human activity. If you want affordable education, affordable medical care, affordable home utility bills, social justice, high-wage jobs and union benefits, and affordable goods and services of all types, high electricity costs are a barrier for that, for everybody. It takes the bottom rung that everybody wants to get on that ladder and moves it that much farther out of reach. You can only spend your money once. We all know that. My 18-year-old hasn't quite figured that out, but you spend it once on gas, you don't have it on date night. The bottom line is, wind energy is a fuel-saving accessory one can add to existing fossil generators. It's not a replacement for fossil plants. No matter the current price of wind energy, wind is only replacing some of the fuel costs for fossil plants and not the plants themselves. So $50 to $110 Michigan wind contracts are saving $25 to $35 worth of fuel. That's it, none of the capital costs of the plant. What about 30% wind? Well, I discussed that a little bit. To achieve 30% wind, because they only produce 30% of their maximum capable output, you'd actually have to build 12,500 megawatts of installed wind capacity. We would need to build 7,000 1.8 megawatt turbines, one turbine for every 5 square miles of the lower peninsula. Price tag, $28 billion, not counting transmission, backup capacity, etc. The thumb loop that Monica talked about, $500 million, 143 miles long. Here's the problem, $28 billion in wind plus transmission. First, they have to be replaced every 20 years because they wear out that fast. We could close all our dirtiest coal plants and replace them with nuclear. It'd be done with the emissions for 60 years. In $28 billion, if we spend it on combined cycle gas plants, would close most of the coal plants in the Midwest. We would we'd get rid of PM 2.5 and mercury emissions almost completely across almost all the Midwest and cut CO2 by more than 50%. Now, which is the better value if you're an environmentalist? And each of those 7,000 turbines will be built inside human and wildlife habitat with results that look like this. That's Huron County. I was just there a few weeks ago. This is Detroit Edison's project. Detroit Edison got friendly zoning in Chandler Township. They wanted Lake Township too, and that township decided they didn't want them there. So Detroit Edison and their law firm, I can't prove Detroit Edison did it, but it's the same law firm they use in Huron County, suddenly came with all their landowners in the next township, and they put together a proposal to annex 40% of the private property in Lake Township. Once it became part of Chandler Township, it would then be subject to Chandler zoning rather than Lake zoning, and they would get the turbines in anyways, even though they weren't taking one contiguous chunk. It was this lot, and this lot, and this house lot, and this lot, and this farm. They were going to take a checkerboard out of Lake Township and slam it into Chandler Township. Had we not drawn a lot of media attention, all it took was a majority vote of a 5-member board in each township, and it would have been a done deal. Can you imagine? This house, you're driving down the road, Lake Township, next house Chandler, next one Lake. When I tell you that it's a fossil fuel company behind wind, that should be all you need to know about how they practice. And this is what it looks like. These are the turbines that have lost the rotor blades. About 33 turbines, they're brand new. They're going to have the blades replaced. Each one's like 167 feet long. They're talking about expanding the landfill now because they have to grind them up and throw them away. You can't recycle carbon fiber rotor blades. They've dropped GE's lost rotors on about 5 or 6 projects. They don't know why. It turns out the blades were made in Brazil, and they think it's a manufacturing defect. More in Huron County. More in Huron County. More in Huron County. And here's back to Missaukee County. It's the same everywhere in the state of Michigan. Here's my final question. If wind energy is unable to cost effectively reduce the externalities of our current generation portfolio or deliver cheaper electricity, why should anyone have to live like this? That's all I have.